Welcome to If You Love This Planet. I'm Dr. Helen Caldecott, and in this program we talk about the greatest medical and environmental threats to all life, such as nuclear weapons and nuclear power, global warming, ozone depletion, toxic pollution, deforestation, and many other social and political issues that relate to global well-being. So if you love this planet, keep listening. Hello and welcome to If You Love This Planet. My guest today is Arnold Gundersen, an energy advisor with Fairwinds Associates, a company which provides research, analysis and paralegal services around environmental and energy issues. An independent nuclear engineering and safety expert, Arnie provides testimony on nuclear operations, reliability, safety and radiation issues to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, congressional and state legislatures, and government agencies and officials throughout the US, Canada, and internationally. He's been a leading voice globally about the impact of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, and he joins us now. Arnie Gundersen, welcome to If You Love This Planet.
Hi, Helen. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Arnie, we haven't talked for about 5 weeks. You're a regular on this program now, and people seem to love to hear you because I think they all really want to know what is going on in Fukushima. So can you bring us up to date now, after 5 weeks, about the latest findings and problems at Fukushima, Arnie?
Well, I think the single biggest thing that happened on the plant site is that TEPCO announced that a large part of the nuclear core melted down from its normal position and melted through the nuclear reactor. It seems that Unit 1 is worse than Unit 2 and 3, but here's what happened. When a nuclear reaction ends, when the control rods fall in, 5% of the heat is still there, not from any nuclear fission, but from all those leftover radioactive isotopes called fission products. So 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're cranking out 500 megawatts like Unit 1 was, 5% is still 25 megawatts. It's a big number.
Define a megawatt, Arnie.
Well, a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts.
It's a million watts, right?
Yes, it's 1,000,000 watts.
Yeah.
So, or it's 1,000 100-watt bulbs, something like that is 1 megawatt. So there's a lot of extra heat that has to be gotten rid of. And Unit 1 failed to get heat into the failed to get water to cool the heat in the nuclear core real early in the accident. And the fuel began to disintegrate. In the process, it cranked out an enormous amount of hydrogen gas. And the net effect was it exploded. We all saw that on the very second day, March 14th. And then after that, of course, it was obvious that the core had collapsed, and that's a meltdown. Now, for the longest time, I was saying that it was melting through the nuclear reactor, but TEPCO was saying, no, it didn't get out of the nuclear reactor. In fact, it's likely that it got out of the nuclear reactor within a day.
Well, describe the nuclear reactor vessel. What is it? How thick is it? What is it made of, Arnie?
Well, the bottom of the nuclear reactor is a bowl, and it's about 8 inches thick. So that's, I'm converting here, Helen, 30 centimeters.
Made of
thick.
what? Made of what?
And it's made of steel.
Yeah.
But in a boiling water reactor, it's got 64 holes in the bottom of it for the control rods to go in and out. And what I believe happened is that the nuclear core, the molten blob at the bottom of the reactor, didn't have to melt its way through 8 inches of concrete. And, of course, TEPCO's position is, well, it took a long time to melt through those 8 inches of concrete.
Concrete or steel? Steel.
Oh, steel. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I need my cup of coffee here. but my position is that it went through one of the holes, and the holes are easily accessible, and it would have drizzled out like soft ice cream. And if one hole failed, it's one thing, but if a whole bunch of holes failed, a lot of nuclear core not only escaped and fell to the bottom of the reactor, but also rapidly escaped from the bottom of the steel, and got to the bottom of the containment. Now, the bottom of the containment is about a meter of concrete. And by this time, after about a day, instead of 5% decay heat, you're down to about 1% decay heat. But that's still, 5 megawatts or 5 million watts of power. And it started to melt its way into the concrete. Most likely it didn't melt concrete, but concrete pops like popcorn when it gets hot because there's oxygen in the concrete. So as it got hot, it would pop and disintegrate, and the core has gradually worked its way into the concrete underneath the nuclear reactor. Now, we're talking about 70 tons of nuclear material. This is a large molten blob of nuclear material is underneath the reactor. The question is, how deep did it go? And it really depends on when it broke through the nuclear reactor, and I think it broke through soon, but also if it began to attack in a narrow area, it would form a crevice. And if it fell through more uniformly, it would form a pancake. Well, a pancake would be easy to cool because there would be a large surface area. But if a crevice was formed, it would lie in that crevice and continue to work its way downward. Now, by today, so now we're 8 months into the accident, and we are at less than 1 megawatt. So from 25 megawatts to 10 to 1, we're at less than 1 megawatt of decay heat. But it's it's now created a crater, essentially, and can't be cooled from above because it's sort of sealed itself off on the top, and it's gradually working its way down into through the concrete. Now, they claim there's about 30 centimeters left, about a foot left, and they also claim that, of course, when it gets through the concrete, there's still about 2 inches of steel in the nuclear containment. Now, that will melt quickly. The concrete will take a lot longer than the steel to melt. So it is possible that over time the core will continue to melt down and get through the nuclear containment. But whether or not that happens, I think we're not going to have a steam explosion. The people keep talking about, well, when the core hits the groundwater, there's going to be a massive steam explosion. There's not enough heat left, less than a megawatt, to cause a massive steam explosion. And I think it'll drizzle out. I think it will gradually come in contact with water and solidify, as opposed to an enormous mass hitting water suddenly, in which case you would get a steam explosion. But I think the real key here is it doesn't matter. The nuclear core is leaking through the containment anyway. It doesn't have to melt down itself into the groundwater. There's so many leaks in that containment into other buildings and out into the ocean anyway that all of the water is in contact with the nuclear fuel. And so therefore the plutonium and the cesium and the strontium that's in the nuclear fuel has run throughout the entire complex anyway and is getting into the groundwater. So it's moot whether or not we have a real meltdown, melt-through China syndrome. In my opinion, we have a meltdown and a melt-through, which is core collapses, gets through the nuclear vessel. And whether or not it ever has a China syndrome doesn't matter because the groundwater is already contaminated because the containment is leaking elsewhere. That was a very long-winded beginning comment, Helen, and I sort of apologize for making it that long.
No, it's fascinating, Arnie, to hear from you. Now, but these are all calculations because they can't get near this molten corium nuclear mass. They don't really know what's going on. So how can they assume, by which calculation, what calculations are they using to work out the data that you just presented?
That's a great question. You're right. They can't get inside the containment. The containment is so radioactive that they haven't even opened the door and let the robots in yet. They've been outside the containment, and the exposures are incredibly high. So, engineers just make a series of assumptions. They can't get within 100 feet of this to verify. So there is no way of determining where that nuclear core really is. And you're absolutely right. I teach geometry, and the word assume, A-S-S-U-M-E, I always tell my geometry students it makes an ass out of you and me.
Oh, well, so we don't really know. Okay, so now...
Unit 2 and 3 had cooling for several hours longer. And it was the first reactor had something called an isolation condenser. And that was the oldest way General Electric built these reactors, was just an isolation condenser. They realized early that that was not a good idea, so on the next 2 reactors, they put a turbine that runs on the steam created from the accident. And that worked for a couple hours longer until it failed also. So they were cooled by this turbine for a little bit longer.
Oh.
And as a result, TEPCO says 90% of the nuclear fuel is melted in Unit 1, and 60% has melted in Unit 2 and 3. It's still an enormous amount of nuclear material has broken through the nuclear reactor and is on the floor of the containment.
In all three
Yes.
units, 1, 2, and
Yes.
3. Yeah. Okay. Now, the groundwater and the amount they've put into the ocean. I want you to address that specifically now, Arnie Gundersen.
Well, they had a leak just this week on in the system that they use to purify the water, and approximately 45,000 pounds of radioactive water was released from the building and got into the Pacific Ocean, and it was very high in strontium. And strontium, of course, you'll remember, is a bone seeker, and is one of the most nasty chemicals that gets released from a nuclear reactor. So that was a surface leak. It ran out of the building, across the ground, and into the ocean.
Oh, really? Got it.
But in addition, there's cracks in the concrete from the earthquake. You got to remember, this site moved. It dropped a foot after the earthquake. The entire land dropped, and when something that big moves, it's got a crack. So there's cracks in the containment. There's cracks in the turbine building, and all of which is allowing groundwater in and radioactive water into the groundwater. So the site is becoming increasingly the groundwater under the site is becoming increasingly contaminated.
And is the groundwater seawater? Is it salt water? It must be, because it's built right next to the ocean, right?
No, it's fresh water.
Oh, it's fresh water.
The flow is from the land into the ocean. It just turns out that way. So that there's fresh water under the site, and the net flow on site is out into the ocean.
Now,
so we're seeing whatever radioactivity is in the groundwater is also moving into the ocean. So, as it's been said, I said it months ago, but other people have now said it too, that this is the absolutely the largest, by at least a factor of 10, radioactive contamination of the ocean that's ever occurred in history.
Well, how much do you estimate has been released into the Pacific Ocean in toto from Fukushima Daiichi?
Well, the number I saw was 30 tetrabecquerel.